Welcome to the Midnight Codex, where forgotten truths breathe and shadows tell their tale. Tonight, don't blink and don't look behind you.
I need to write this down. Maybe someone will believe me when I'm gone. The words echo in my mind, louder than any other thought I've ever had. This may be the only chance I have left to make sense of what's happening. It's not just a job, it's a nightmare. I thought I was just taking a job, but now I wonder if I'll survive the night. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for months. The weight of overdue bills and the growing stack of rejection letters had become unbearable. When the ad popped up on my screen, security guard needed for remote mansion, I barely thought twice before applying. The pay was high, the work simple. Stay on site and monitor the grounds. It was everything I needed. They called me the next day. The voice on the other end was gruff, like something from an old horror movie. Report to the Blackwood Mansion by sundown. You'll be given 7 rules. Break them, and you'll never leave here alive. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just another odd job posting. But something in the tone of the man's voice made me pause. The warning lingered in my mind like a bad taste, but I couldn't afford to pass up a good opportunity. I packed my bags and drove through the thickening woods, the mansion standing tall and cold in the distance as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The place looked like something from a Gothic novel. Towering spires and a maze of broken windows greeted me as I approached the front gate. The gate creaked as it closed behind me, and I didn't notice it at the time, but I should have. Something in the air changed right then. It felt heavier, like I was stepping into a place that didn't belong in the real world. The wind didn't stir, and the usual sounds of wildlife were eerily absent. The house seemed to swallow all sound, leaving only an unnerving silence. A man dressed in a dark suit, far too formal for the setting, greeted me at the door. His face was cold, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You're the new guard. Follow me," he said, barely making eye contact. There was no time for pleasantries and no room for questions. He led me inside, past dusty hallways and a grand staircase that seemed to stretch forever into the shadows. The mansion felt like a place that had forgotten time, a place out of place with the rest of the world. "Here's your office." The man gestured to a small, dimly lit room at the far end of the hallway. It felt like a prison cell, more than a security room. "You'll stay here and monitor the cameras. Don't leave, don't interact with anyone. Just watch. Got it?" I nodded, confused. "Got it." And then, as he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at me with a strange, lingering gaze. "The rules are important. They'll keep you safe. Don't break them. Ever." Before I could ask what rules, he was gone, leaving me alone in the room with only a flickering light overhead and a strange sense of foreboding. I settled into the chair, my fingers trembling as I reached for the paperwork on the desk. I was about to learn the 7 rules of Blackwood Mansion. I barely had time to read the first one before I heard the sound of the door creaking open again. "You'll be given 7 rules," the man's voice returned, as if he had never left. "Break them, and you'll never leave here alive." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up. The man wasn't there. Only a cold gust of air swept through the room. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind. But deep down, something inside me felt wrong. "The rules," he had said. I looked down at the list. Never leave the security room after midnight. No matter what you hear, no matter how tempting it seems, stay in the room. Don't open the main entrance for anyone. The doors are locked for a reason. Never turn off the lights in the hallways. The darkness is not your friend here. Do not speak to the spirits. They will try to communicate with you, but ignore them. Don't ever open the door to the basement. If you do, something will escape. Stay out of the owner's bedroom. That room holds the key to this place's secrets. Never touch any of the artifacts left behind by the previous owner. They are cursed. I took a deep breath, trying to digest the madness. Cursed artifacts? Spirits? What kind of place was this? I felt a twinge of fear in my chest. This wasn't some simple security job. It was something else, something dark. The man had said I'd never leave alive if I broke the rules. But there was one thought I couldn't shake. Who exactly am I working for? And why does this place feel like it's watching me? The light flickered again, and I heard a distant sound. Was it footsteps? Or something else? I stood up, my body tensing. Maybe this was a mistake. But the money. I needed it. And if it meant surviving the night in this creepy mansion, then I'd follow the rules, no matter how strange they seemed. For now, I'd have to live with the feeling that I wasn't alone here, and that something was waiting for me in the darkness. She's the only thing keeping me sane right now. I spent the first few hours wandering the mansion, trying to familiarize myself with the layout. The air inside was stale, almost suffocating, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. The flickering lights, the creaking floors, everything felt off, like the house itself was aware of my presence. But I had a job to do, and I couldn't let my nerves get the best of me. The manager had made it clear. Stay in the security room, follow the rules, and everything would be fine. But the more I thought about those rules, the stranger they seemed. Never leave the security room after midnight. It felt almost like a warning. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up at the thought. What could possibly be so dangerous out there that I couldn't leave the room? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But then again, I always felt uneasy in places like this. I'd always been an anxious person, never quite comfortable in new situations, always second-guessing my choices. Still, I didn't have much of a choice. I needed the money more than anything else. My savings were gone, and my rent was overdue. I'd spent weeks searching for a job, and the Blackwood Mansion job was the only thing that had come through. I still remembered Pixel, my cat, curled up beside me when I made the decision to accept the job. Her purring was the only thing that kept me sane in those final days before I packed my things and left. I'd always been a cat person. Pixel was a rescue I'd adopted years ago. She was a quiet companion, but somehow she made everything seem less lonely. I couldn't help but feel the absence of her now. She had stayed behind with a friend while I took this job, but I missed her presence, her soft meows in the morning. I walked back into the security room, trying to push aside the nagging thoughts in my head. The clock on the wall showed it was already 10:30 p.m. The mansion seemed to grow quieter the longer I stayed. No sounds of birds or the wind, no rustling of trees, just an oppressive silence that weighed on me. I settled into the chair at the monitor, adjusting the screen and checking the camera feeds. The mansion was massive, and the cameras were spread thin, but I had to keep my focus. There was no other choice. I glanced at the list of rules again. I read through them for the 100th time, trying to make sense of them. Never leave the security room after midnight. Don't open the main entrance for anyone. Never turn off the lights in the hallways. Do not speak to the spirits. Don't ever open the door to the basement. Stay out of the owner's bedroom. Never touch any of the artifacts left behind by the previous owner. The more I read, the stranger they seemed. Spirits? Artifacts? This didn't feel like a job. It felt like a warning, but the money was too good to pass up. I had no other options. I looked around, checking the monitors again. There was no one in sight, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the house was staring at me, like it knew every thought in my head. The walls felt closer with every minute, and the air grew heavier, pressing in on me. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the rules. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The mansion creaked again. I looked up at the camera feed, but there was nothing unusual. My mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to push the fear down and focus on the monitors, but the sensation of being watched wouldn't leave me. Then, just as I was about to glance at the basement feed, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the hallway, perfectly still. It wasn't supposed to be there. No one was supposed to be there. I blinked, and it was gone. Nothing but empty hallway. I checked the cameras again, my heart pounding. The hallway was still empty. I had to have imagined it, or had I? I wasn't sure anymore. I rushed to the window, looking out over the dark landscape of the mansion. There was nothing. Just trees and the darkened horizon. But the feeling of being watched, that was still there, and it was stronger now. I glanced back at the list of rules again. It almost felt like they were suffocating me. These weren't just rules, they were shackles. Never leave the security room after midnight. I knew then that I wasn't sure if the real danger was outside the room or if it was something I couldn't even begin to understand. But one thing was certain. Something was wrong. The house wasn't just old and abandoned, it was alive. And it was watching me. I tried to distract myself by checking the other cameras, but the feeling never went away. I couldn't shake the eerie presence that seemed to be lingering just beyond the camera's view. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the dim lights, every whisper in the wind, it all felt like a threat. And the manager's words echoed in my mind. Break the rules, and you'll never leave here alive. The voice, the shadow. Could it all be part of the job? Or was something much darker at play here? Who exactly am I working for? And why does this place feel like it's watching me? The clock had barely struck midnight when the first real challenge arrived. I had spent the last few hours pacing the security room, checking the monitors, and listening to every creak and groan the house made as it settled. The house was restless, but maybe it was just my nerves. The wind had started howling outside, rattling the windows, and there was something about the darkness that felt different here. It wasn't just nightfall. It was something else, something heavy, as if the very air was watching me, waiting for me to break. The rules had been clear, almost too clear. Never leave the security room after midnight. I kept repeating that rule to myself, but the house felt bigger now, darker, as if it was swallowing me whole. I had been so focused on staying put, on following the rules that had been drilled into me, that I hadn't really thought about what would happen if I didn't. But now, I was beginning to wonder if there was something worse than the house itself, something in the shadows that wasn't bound by the rules at all. I shook the thought away. I had to focus. I had to stay in control. But then, the monitors flickered. The screen for the main entrance camera went black, just for a second, before it snapped back to life. There, standing in front of the doors, was a figure. At first, I thought it was some kind of malfunction. The figure looked blurry, distorted, like a shadow that shouldn't have been there. But then the shape solidified, and I saw the figure more clearly. A man, tall and thin, standing motionless, staring, straight ahead. My breath caught in my throat. The rules said, never open the main entrance for anyone. But this was different. I wasn't supposed to see anyone out there, and yet there he was. My pulse quickened as I leaned in closer to the monitor, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight on the desk. What should I do? Should I follow the rule and ignore him? What if he was lost? What if he needed help? Number. The rule was there for a reason. I remembered what the manager had said. Stay in the room. Do not interact with anyone. But as I sat there, staring at the figure through the screen, something inside me twisted. Why couldn't I just let him in? What harm could there be in one mistake? The figure outside turned his head slightly, as if sensing my gaze, and my heart froze. It was as if he could see me, as if he knew I was watching. Then he raised his hand and knocked once, slowly, deliberately. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the room like a thunderclap in the dead silence of the mansion. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I knew I should ignore him, that I should follow the rules. But the longer I stared at the man, the more desperate I felt. I couldn't explain it. The way he stood there, so still, so calm, it felt unnatural. But it also felt like he was waiting for me to do something, like I was supposed to let him in. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the lock. Then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, almost like a breeze moving through the room, but then it grew louder. Let me in. The voice was distant, yet it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt the air in the room shift. It wasn't the voice of the man outside, though. It was something else, something older, deeper. And suddenly, the weight of the rules hit me with full force. I jumped up from the desk and backed away, What was I doing? I thought of the manager's warning. Break the rules and you'll never leave here alive. The words echoed in my head, and I realized how foolish I had been. I had already made my first mistake. And just like that, I knew the cost of breaking the rules wasn't just losing the job, it was my life. I turned away from the door and rushed back to the monitor, my heart racing in my chest. I looked at the figure again, still standing outside, still staring at the door. His face was now fully visible, but something about it was wrong. His eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to pierce through the screen, through me. The knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was far worse. The air in the room felt thicker, colder. It was as if the entire mansion had held its breath, waiting for something. I gripped the desk, trying to steady myself. My mind was spinning, but one thought kept coming back. I had broken the rule. The first rule. And now, I wasn't sure if I'd survive the night. The cameras flickered again, and the figure was gone. But the dread remained. It gnawed at me, deep in my chest. I had failed. I had let him in even if I hadn't physically opened the door. I'd already broken the most important rule, and now the mansion knew. It knew I wasn't following the rules, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for my next move. The mansion had been quiet for days, but the silence was becoming unbearable. I had already violated the first rule, and the dread that followed hadn't faded. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls seemed like a reminder of what I had done. I kept thinking I could hear footsteps behind me, even when I was alone. The house had a way of making me feel like I was being watched, even when I wasn't in the security room. I couldn't escape it. I tried to stay in the room, tried to follow the rules, but my mind kept returning to what I had seen. The figure outside the door, the way it seemed to know I was watching. The whisper, "Let me in." I hadn't been able to shake it, and that's when the temptation came again. The basement. Rule 5. Don't ever open the door to the basement. I had heard strange noises coming from that part of the house, faint sounds like something or someone scratching at the walls. Every time I passed by, I felt the door to the basement staring at me, daring me to open it. I'd seen it on the cameras, the shadows that moved behind it, the strange flickers of light, but I had never dared to approach it, not until tonight. I couldn't help it anymore. The curiosity, the fear, the sheer desperation to understand. It all drove me to the same decision. I had already broken the rules once. What was one more? I stood up from the desk, the cold air pressing against my skin. The house felt heavier now, more oppressive, like something was about to happen. I couldn't ignore the pull toward the basement door any longer. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door loomed ahead. It was old, creaking at the hinges, and yet it held a strange allure. The dark, the unknown, it was calling to me, beckoning me closer with every step. I reached out, my hand shaking as I touched the cold brass doorknob. The moment I turned it, I felt the temperature drop, as though the air around me thickened. The door opened slowly, almost unwillingly, as if something inside was trying to keep it closed, but I pushed harder, and it groaned open. I stepped into the basement. It was pitch black, but the flashlight cut through the darkness. The beam swept over shelves lined with dust-covered objects, old books, jars filled with odd symbols, and strange tools that I couldn't immediately identify. The air was thick with mildew and something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. It smelled faintly of decay. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding. Something about this place made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to see what was down here, but I kept moving, feeling drawn to the center of the room. As I moved deeper into the space, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. On the far wall, carved into the stone, was an elaborate symbol, some kind of ancient sigil. It looked like a twisted form of a pentagram, surrounded by runes that seemed to shift and shimmer in the flashlight's glow. I felt the weight of the air press down on me, and my mind screamed for me to leave. But I couldn't. Something about this place, this room, drew me in. I stepped closer to the symbol. I could hear my breath echo in my ears as I kneeled down to get a better look. The floor was cold under my knees, and as I leaned closer, I noticed something more. The stone floor had been worn down in places, almost as if it had been used for rituals. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but the pulse of the sigil beneath my fingers felt real. Too real. It was as if it was alive, calling out to me, pulling at my very soul. I yanked my hand back, breath quickening. What had I just done? I had to leave. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run back to the safety of the security room, to forget everything I had seen. But the door behind me creaked shut, as if the house itself didn't want me to leave. I was trapped. And then I heard it. A sound, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. A low, guttural sound, the unmistakable thud of footsteps approaching. I turned and shined the flashlight at the stairs leading back up, but there was nothing there. The footsteps kept getting closer until I could feel them vibrating through the floor. It was too late. I had already broken the rule. I rushed toward the stairs, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. I could hear the breathing now, ragged, heavy, just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the top of the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. But as I rushed back down the hallway, my heart skipped a beat. The light from the security room was flickering, and I could see a shadow moving in the dark. I froze, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. There, standing in the doorway of the security room, was a figure. It was tall, its shape barely visible in the darkness, but I could feel its presence, cold and menacing. I hadn't opened the door for anyone. I hadn't let anyone in. Yet, there it was. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. And in that moment, I knew. I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. The moment I stepped back into the security room, I knew something had changed. The air felt different, heavier, colder, like the walls were closing in on me. I had broken the rules, and the house, the mansion, was aware of it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. The house was old, full of creaks and groans, and it had been abandoned for so long that it was bound to feel unsettling. But deep down, I knew. I could feel it. The house was alive, and it was waiting. The next night, the first consequence of my violation came. At first, it was subtle. The flicker of a light that shouldn't have been there, the faintest whisper in the hallways, a cold breeze where there shouldn't have been one. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I hadn't slept properly in days, always lying awake thinking about the basement, about the sigil, about the figure in the hallway. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe. The house, now more than ever, was awake. But then, the shadows began to move. I was sitting at the desk, staring blankly at the monitors when I saw the first one, a shadow darting across the hallway camera. I froze, leaning closer, my heart racing. It wasn't just the usual dark corner or flickering camera. This shadow moved with purpose, as if it had a mind of its own. I switched to another camera, a figure, standing in the doorway of one of the upstairs rooms. I blinked, and it was gone. My breath hitched. I knew what I saw. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I stood up, pacing the room, the anxiety gnawing at my chest. I needed to get out. I needed to leave the mansion, but the idea of breaking the rules again, of leaving, terrified me. The house was watching, and I was afraid that if I broke another rule, it would consume me. The shadows grew more active. They weren't just passing by now. They were waiting, watching, and they were getting closer. The cold became unbearable. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. I was shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something darker. I couldn't explain it, but the shadows were there, in the room with me, moving just out of the corner of my eye. And then, that night, they spoke. I was sitting in the security room, staring at the monitors, when a voice whispered into my ear. It was soft at first, like a rustling breeze, but it quickly grew louder, sharper. "You broke the rules." I whipped around, but there was no one there, just the empty room. But the voice wasn't gone. It echoed in my head, reverberating through my thoughts, drowning out everything else. You will pay. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened and the walls seemed to close in on me. I stumbled backward, but the door behind me slammed shut. The house wasn't letting me leave. It was holding me in place, trapping me. The shadows in the room grew darker, more defined. I could feel them now, pressing against me, like they were alive, like they were watching me. The whispers became louder, more insistent. You will never leave. I ran to the door and yanked it open, desperate to escape. But when I stepped out into the hallway, the shadows followed. They were everywhere, crawling along the walls, lurking in every corner. I couldn't see them directly, but I could feel their presence, feel their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I tried to run, but the walls seemed to close in on me, pushing me back toward the center of the mansion, toward the place where the shadows gathered. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? The house wouldn't let me. The whispers continued, and the shadows never stopped moving. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see them, those dark figures standing just out of view, waiting for me to make my next mistake. Days passed, but the nightmarish presence in the mansion never left. I couldn't escape it. Every time I stepped into a new room, the shadows were there, watching, waiting for me to break another rule. I was losing my grip on reality. I could feel the fatigue setting in, the exhaustion pulling at me, but every time I closed my eyes, the whispers grew louder. You will pay. You will never leave. And then, one night, it happened again. I fell asleep, exhausted, drained. But this time I wasn't alone. I woke up in the dark, but it wasn't the usual quiet of the mansion. There was a figure standing at the foot of my bed, its shape barely visible in the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. And then I heard the whisper again, but this time it wasn't in my ear. If you don't follow the rules, you will never leave. The figure stepped closer, and I felt my heart stop. It wasn't human. It didn't feel human. It was something else, something old, something ancient. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed, unable to escape the figure looming over me. It reached out a hand, and I couldn't breathe. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and I felt a pressure building inside my chest. You've been warned. The figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished. And just like that, I woke up in the security room, gasping for breath. I was back where I started. The room was empty, the monitors flickering in front of me. But I knew. I knew that the mansion wasn't finished with me yet. The first warning had come, and the next one, I feared, would be worse. The house was no longer just a haunted relic of the past. It had become a prison, and I was its captive. Each passing hour felt like a lifetime, as if the mansion itself was stretching time, holding me hostage in its dark, oppressive walls. The whispers never stopped. The shadows were always there, lurking just out of sight. And now, the house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It felt like something more sinister was at play. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something terrifying. The rules weren't just random. They weren't just bizarre guidelines to keep me safe. They were there to keep something locked away, something ancient, something that shouldn't be freed. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The strange symbols in the basement, the whispering voices, the feeling of being watched, they all pointed to something much darker than I had first believed. The spirits I had been encountering weren't just lost souls. They were trapped, bound by these rules. They weren't here by choice. They were guardians, keeping something at bay. I needed answers. I had to know more about this mansion, about its origins, about its true purpose. The house had become a maze in my mind, and I was desperate to find the way out. The first step was to search for any records, any history of the mansion that might explain what was going on. I couldn't trust the cameras anymore, and the whispers in my ear made it impossible to sleep. So, I went to the one place I hadn't dared explore before, the library. The library was an enormous, dust-covered room at the back of the mansion, lined with old bookshelves filled with volumes that looked centuries old. The air smelled musty, and as I entered, The floor creaked beneath my feet, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent room. It was a place that seemed untouched by time, almost as if it had been forgotten by everyone, including the house itself. I started pulling books from the shelves, flipping through pages of decaying, yellowed paper. Some of the texts were written in languages I didn't recognize, others in strange symbols that made my skin crawl. The deeper I dug, the more I found references to rituals, symbols, and legends I couldn't understand. Then, I came across something that made my blood run cold. One old leather-bound book was different from the rest. It was ancient, its pages stiff with age, but the writing inside was clearer than the rest. The title on the cover was worn, but I could just make out the words, "The Binding of the Blackwood." I opened the book carefully, my hands shaking. As I read, the truth began to unfurl before me. The mansion wasn't just a haunted house. It was built to house something far worse. An ancient entity bound by a series of rituals and rules, its power kept in check by those who followed them. The rules weren't just precautions. They were a means to keep this entity imprisoned. The house was a prison, and I had unwittingly stepped into it. The sigils in the basement, the strange symbols, the oppressive atmosphere. They were all part of a ritual designed to keep this entity locked away from the world. I read about the original owner of the mansion, Victor Blackwood, a man who had delved into dark, forbidden magic, seeking immortality and power at any cost. It was he who had bound the entity here, but not before making a terrible pact. The pact involved sacrifice, souls to feed the entity's hunger and bind it to this place. The rules were simple. Those who came to guard the mansion had to follow the laws laid out by Blackwood or face the consequences. I dropped the book as if it had burned me. This wasn't just a house, full of spirits. It was a prison, a place built to contain something far worse than ghosts. I couldn't understand it all, but the message was clear. I was trapped, and the only way out was to follow the rules, to never leave the security room, to never speak to the spirits, to never open the basement door. But I also knew something else. I couldn't follow the rules forever. The mansion was suffocating me. I'd already broken the first rule, and the shadows, the whispers, they were getting stronger, more aggressive. I could feel the entity growing restless, as if it was aware of my defiance. It wanted to break free, and if I didn't stop it, there would be no escaping. I realized then that the only way out was to break all the rules, one final desperate act to free myself from this place. But breaking the rules came with consequences, consequences I couldn't fully understand. Would I be able to control what I was about to unleash? Would the entity destroy me if I dared to defy it? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. I had to make a choice. I had to break the rules again, but I had no idea what would happen next. The mansion had become my entire world, a prison with no walls but infinite boundaries. Every inch of it seemed to breathe, to watch, to judge. The whispers that had haunted me from the first day now seemed louder, more insistent, a constant reminder that I couldn't escape. I had violated the rules once already, and I knew that whatever I had unleashed in doing so, it wasn't finished. It was growing. I had been careful since then. So careful. I stayed in the security room, kept my distance from the basement, never tried to open the doors that led deeper into the heart of the house. But it wasn't enough. The mansion had changed. The walls were closing in on me, and the very air felt thick, suffocating. The weight of the decision pressed on me. I kept returning to the question that had plagued me since I first realized the truth about this place. What do I do now? The house itself seemed to be telling me there was no way out. I'd followed the rules, but they hadn't protected me. The entity I had unleashed had already begun to make itself known, and the more I resisted, the more it seemed to retaliate. I had tried to ignore it, to pretend that the whispers were just in my mind, but the shadows were real. The suffocating cold in the air was real. Every time I turned around, I felt its eyes on me, waiting, watching, trying to break through whatever was left of the rules. And I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't live like this, trapped in a house full of nightmares. What was the point of following the rules if the very foundation of this place was built to hold something worse than death itself? I couldn't keep pretending that everything would go back to normal if I just followed the same tired commands. The truth was, the mansion had already claimed me. The moment I broke the first rule, I had given up the right to be free. There was no safe choice anymore. My only choice now was to break the final rule, the one I had feared the most: never open the door to the basement. The basement had always been the place I'd been warned away from, the one I knew held the key to everything. It was where the entity had been locked away, chained by the rules. But that same entity was now free, restless, and I was no longer willing to sit by and watch as it crept closer. I couldn't live in constant fear, wondering what would happen if I just stayed put and obeyed. I stood in front of the basement door, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand trembled as I reached for the cold brass doorknob. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew what I was about to do. But it didn't matter. I twisted the knob. The door creaked open, slow and reluctant, like it too was aware of the consequences. As I stepped inside, I could feel the temperature drop instantly. The darkness inside the basement seemed alive, swirling around me, pressing in from all sides, and there, in the center of the room, was the thing that had been waiting for me. I couldn't see it clearly at first. The shadows seemed to twist around it, distorting its form, but I could feel it. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. It wasn't just a spirit or a demon. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't be free. The air grew thicker, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around me. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my mind racing. This was it. This was what I had been trying to avoid. The sigils I had seen earlier began to glow faintly in the darkness, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. They were no longer just symbols. They were part of the cage that had held the entity in place. And as I stepped closer, I knew the cage was broken. The entity was no longer bound by the rules, and I had just unlocked the final door. The ground beneath my feet trembled, as if the house itself was shaking in response to the entity's release. I could feel the floor shift beneath me. The walls groaned. The ceiling above me began to bend and stretch, as if the mansion was altering its very shape, changing in response to the entity's awakening. The mansion wasn't just a prison anymore. It was alive, and I had unleashed it. I had no choice now. I had to face it. I had to break the rules and accept whatever fate awaited me. And then, everything shifted. The walls began to bend and twist, as if the mansion itself was alive. The air crackled with energy, and the floor beneath me groaned as though the house was stretching, changing shape to match the entity that had been released. The basement door slammed shut behind me, and I heard a low growl, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. The mansion was no longer the place I had once known. It had become something else, something darker. I had made my decision. I had broken the rules. And now the house was changing. The walls seemed to shift, moving in ways I couldn't comprehend. The mansion was no longer just a prison. It was alive. Everything changed the moment I broke the final rule. The moment the basement door creaked open, the mansion seemed to wake up. The air grew thick, suffocating, swirling with an energy I couldn't describe. The house trembled, groaning as if it were alive, as if it were breathing with me, reacting to the entity I had unleashed. The sigils on the walls began to pulse, glowing faintly in the shadows, their power unraveling with each second. I felt the very foundation of the house shifting beneath my feet, the walls bending and stretching like the mansion itself was being pulled into another realm. It wasn't just haunted anymore. It wasn't just a place full of spirits. The spirits themselves, they changed. The first ghost I saw after opening the door was no longer a fleeting shadow, a lost soul trapped in the walls. Number. These were something else. Their features were twisted, their eyes glowing with unnatural light, their bodies contorting in ways that defied nature. They weren't just spirits. They were something far worse. Their forms were made of pure, writhing darkness, hungrily reaching for me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I staggered backward, heart pounding in my chest. The mansion was alive. and it was hungry. The air grew colder. I could feel the presence of the entity, the one I had unleashed. It was close. I could hear it, feel it stirring in the walls, like a storm gathering strength. The house was no longer the silent, watchful prison it had once been. It was a battlefield, a place where the supernatural was free to run wild. And then, the chaos began. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in the hallway any longer. The walls closed in around me, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend, as if they were alive. The spirits were everywhere now, not just appearing in fleeting glimpses, but moving, closing in on me, surrounding me. Their voices were deafening, rising in an eerie chorus. "You've unleashed us. You cannot escape." I could feel the heat of the mansion's transformation. The ground beneath me vibrated as though the house was coming apart, the very structure of the building breaking down. The air was thick with dark energy, and I could feel my skin crawl as I stumbled forward. The basement wasn't the end of it. The whole house had become a prison of nightmares. I couldn't escape. The door to the security room slammed shut behind me, trapping me. I spun around looking for another way out, but the walls were closing in on me. The doors had disappeared, the windows, nothing but darkness on the other side. It was as though the mansion had no intention of letting me leave. I heard a voice behind me, soft but unmistakable. "You broke the rules, and now you will pay." I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't a spirit. It wasn't a ghost. It was the entity. The very thing I had let out. Its form was shifting, a mass of darkness and light, its shape constantly changing. It reached out, its tendrils, grasping toward me, pulling at the very fabric of my being. I tried to run, but the floor beneath me seemed to give way. I fell, my heart racing as I tumbled through the now uneven floor. I scrambled to my feet, but I couldn't find solid ground. The mansion was twisting, warping, like it was alive, and it was fighting me, trying to pull me deeper into its chaos. And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard a loud crack, the sound of something breaking. The mansion shook violently. Suddenly, the walls split open, revealing an endless void beyond. The air was colder than anything I had ever felt, and I saw flashes of light, images of places and things I couldn't comprehend. The void stretched out before me, infinite, and yet there was no escape. Was this the end? Was this the price for breaking the rules? I could feel the entity moving closer, its power overwhelming, consuming everything in its path. I looked around, my heart beating wildly, searching for any way to escape. The door to the outside world, the door I had entered when I first took the job, was nowhere to be found. Everything began to blur. The walls, the shadows, the whispers, the screaming voices, it was all becoming one, and the figure, the entity, was coming for me. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something caught my eye. A glimmer of light, faint but unmistakable, shining through the cracks in the floor. I reached out for it, driven by the last shred of hope I had. My fingers grazed the light, and in that instant, everything stopped. The entity froze. The mansion stopped shifting. The walls stopped closing in. For a brief moment, everything was silent. But I could hear something else now. A low, hollow sound. A voice. "You are part of it now." I felt my heart stop. The mansion had taken me. And in that moment, I realized what had happened. The mansion had claimed me. I had broken the rules, and now I was no longer just a visitor. I was a part of it. And as I looked around, I understood. I was no longer the one to escape. I had become a part of the mansion, of its curse, one of the trapped souls, one of the spirits.